Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. When we look at the church in the 21st century, there are multiple aspects and approaches we can take. It's quite a thing. Given the fact that the New Testament was written in the first century, how do we apply it, or how does it apply by the Holy Spirit's design to the church in the 21st century? Marco aptly mentions Francis Schaeffer's book, a book that I had as a young believer. And I do echo his remarks concerning what Francis Schaeffer wrote at that time. But now we've gone beyond that. Now we're not at the church at the end of the 20th century. We're into the 21st century. Of course, we all know the apocalyptic and prophetic texts, the book of Revelation, the Olivet Discourse, the writings of the last days and Thessalonians and so forth. But there's another aspect that I always look at that's something I look at because it's too often overlooked. I've only done this a couple of times, maybe twice, and I keep updating it and modifying it with the time, but I do think it is a very fundamentally important approach to understand the church before Jesus comes back, to understand the church in the 21st century. Look with me, please, to the book of Romans, chapter 1, the epistle to the Romans, chapter 1. As we always point out, it's useless trying to understand the future prophetically unless we understand the past as a shadow of it. If you don't know history, we're never going to understand prophecy. Unless we know where we came from, we won't understand where we are, and much less will we understand where we're going. The kinds of situations that the first century church found themselves in, the cultural environment, the religious environment, the morally deficient environment, what they found themselves in tells us what we find ourselves in and what we're going to find ourselves in. Let's begin with Romans chapter 1, if you please. Verse 24, 26, and 28. Therefore, God gave them over to the lusts of their heart to impurity. Verse 26, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for the women exchanged the natural for that which is unnatural, and the same way men abandoned the natural function of the woman, etc., burned in their desires for one another. Verse 28, just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind. Notice verse 24, 26, and 28, 3 times the text reiterates, God gave them over. He ultimately gave them over to their own depravity. He gave them over to their own depravity. But we're also told in Romans chapter 1 that the wrath of God is coming. The Greek word orge. Christians are not appointed unto wrath. They are not appointed unto wrath. Hence we have what some might call an eschatological overtone in the text. There's something about it that foreshadows the wrath of God to come. Remember, wrath is not the same as tribulation. Tribulation is thlipsis. Tribulation comes from the devil. Wrath comes from God. It's when he pours out his judgment. Now, a foreshadow of the wrath of God that will come at the end of the age happened in the first century. Things happened in the first century that affected the known world and that affected Israel and the Jews particularly. But we're talking about Rome, which was the predominant world power at the time. Rome was like a polis, a city-state of Greece, only like Babylon, it had expanded into a massive, massive empire. This was Rome, and things happened. Mount Vesuvius blew up after the destruction of the Jewish temple. Volcanic ash was deposited massively into the ionosphere. The sun and moon did not give their light. The Roman Empire, Asia Minor and elsewhere, was racked by a series of frequent earthquakes that would, by modern measures of gauging them, be high on the Richter scale. Much destruction. The city of Laodicea was at one point completely destroyed by an earthquake. These things happened, but also there were the events surrounding 70 AD as predicted by Daniel and Jesus, and the destruction of the temple. But Rome itself, however, the wrath came on Rome. When did the wrath come on Rome? Under Nero, it burned to the ground. The epicenter of the Roman Empire, the eternal city, was utterly destroyed and left in flaming ruins. Not much was left. Now, if you've been to Rome and you see the excavations of ancient Rome with the Capitolina and the Palatina and the Seven Hills and the Forum and where the Colosseum is today and so forth, you say it was of impressive size, and it would have been. It would have been. It would have been an absolutely massive fire, something on the scale of the Great Fire of London in the 1600s, only bigger. Something that was incredible. It was coming. But that is only a harbinger, a foreshadow of what is going to happen in the last days. 3 times God gives them over. He gives them over because of the lust of their heart. He gives them over because of homosexual and lesbian perversity. And he gives them over because they reject him. And upon rejecting him, they go into moral depravity. God gives them over. When people are given over, if an individual is given over, it's usually something we theologically or doctrinally associate with the spirit of error. When large groups of people are given over, it is setting the stage for wrath. For instance, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, for this reason, God gave them over. They're going to follow the Antichrist because God gave them over, Paul tells us in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. But here in Romans, 3 times, God gave them over. You see the way the world is. Now, Paul is desperate in Romans 1, desperate to preach the gospel before the wrath of God comes. He's desperate. Verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. But he says he has this desire to preach the gospel before it comes. We need to have this perspective. We think as Christians about the tribulation, but the scripture, although it teaches a tribulation, it puts the emphasis on the wrath, on the wrath. Satan can only destroy the flesh. God can destroy the flesh and the spirit. It is the wrath. Save yourself from the wrath to come. Again, the book I always recommend for young believers particularly is The Pilgrim's Progress. The wrath is coming. We need to, as I've said multiple times, put our emphasis in the 21st century, not simply on the gospel, but specifically on the gospel of the kingdom. Judgment is coming. Judgment is coming. Frightening things are happening. You know, we're told in Leviticus 19:19, do not mix the seed, not just agriculturally, but zoologically. Now they've got these monkey embryos with 6% human DNA. It was announced yesterday. We know what this is eventually going to come to. Some kind of demonoid. You have to wonder now if some of the monsters and the creatures that you see in the apocalyptic literature and in Isaiah are actually not physical and literal demonic beings. I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying it's going that way. The seed is being mixed zoologically. Now, they may be doing that to have a basis to harvest organs for transplantation for legitimate medical reasons. That may be the case. But remember, anything fallen man can use for evil, he ultimately will, unless he is subordinated to God in Christ. Any technology, any science, anything unsaved people can use for evil will be used for evil. The world is in the power of the wicked one. But we've reached a point now where there's this giving over. They've been given over. The apathy you encounter, the acceptance you see of the homosexual agenda becoming more radical, demanding the right to teach it to your children, and getting children to inform on their parents that they're opposed to it. These kinds of things is because God has given them over to it. How can you have rational people, scientists and physicians, who know there's X and Y chromosomes, but they will accept transgenderism? They will call a female a male and a male a female. They can play sports for the teams of the opposite sex. That the military has to not distinguish between male and female orthomusculature based on gender preference, not based on chromosomal gender. Well, how can intelligent people, reasonable people, educated in science, go along with this? It makes no sense that a genetic scientist or a physician who knows it's all false accepts it. That people in legislatures and parliaments accept it as legally true, even though it is scientifically false. How can it happen? How can they say this? Everybody knows a chromosomal male is going to play better sports than a female. Oh no, you can't say that. That's gender discrimination. You're a homophobe or you're a transgenderphobe. Reason is suspended. That which is illogical, absurd, is socially and legally accepted, even by people who, in terms of science and education, know it is wrong. How can this happen to a society? How can intelligent, educated people do this? Because, and only because, God has given them over. They've been given over. We have to understand that is the sociological, the theological, and the spiritual reality of the mission field in which we are called to proclaim the gospel. You can find individuals, but when the Lord gives somebody over, it is very, very unlikely they will not come to perdition. And when the Lord gives a society over, that society is doomed to wrath. Yet we are here now, before the wrath comes, to proclaim the gospel while there's still time. It is absolutely essential that we understand that for ourselves, for our families, for our churches. If we don't understand that, there's nothing else to be said. We must know the time in which we live. Jesus spoke about knowing the times and the seasons. This is the season. I don't want to go into it now, but we know many ways that the world is being prepared for the advent of Antichrist. Now let's go a bit further with this. In God's reckoning, the return of Christ that we seem likely to see in the 21st century, though we can't speculate about dates, is different than other times in history when true believers thought it was the end. The reason being, of course, that the prophecies of Luke 21:24, Matthew 23:39, Zechariah 12:1-10, etc., can only be fulfilled now that the Jews are back in their land and in Jerusalem. Those things did not happen at the other times in history when believers thought that the Lord was coming in their lifetime. This makes this time different. The return of Christ depends on God's prophetic purpose for the faithful church and for Israel and the Jews. These are the two things we have to look at. But for our purposes today, we need to look at these things in light of the New Testament. Turn with me, please, to the book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18. I'll begin in verse 1. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. This is Paul. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. There was a climate of growing anti-Semitism and Jew hatred that would climax with the events of 70 AD predicted by Jesus and Daniel. A growing climate of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. But within that, there was a division within the Jewish community over the messiahship of Yeshua, over Jesus being the Messiah. Now, we have evidence of that in the New Testament, but I'd like to go to a historical source, Suetonius. Suetonius said, and another source is Josephus, but we're looking at Suetonius. The Jews faced expulsion under Claudius. Some say this was around 41 AD. Others, and I tend to agree it was later, 49 AD. That would have placed Paul in Corinth around 50 or 51 Anno Domini. Suetonius says that this expulsion of the Jews by the Emperor Claudius was due to Christus. Now, some scholars have tried to say that is not Christ in Latin exactly. However, Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, tells us in Latin it was a variation of Christ. Of Christ, it was used for Jesus in Rome. Christos or Christius, there were different variations. Justin Martyr says this is one of the terms Christ was popularly known as in Roman society, not necessarily by the church, but by the pagans. Now, let's understand the whole background of this. Claudius, followed the madman Emperor Caligula. During the reign of Caligula, a number of very, very important things happened. All of them immersed in moral decadence. But let's look at what was happening and how it affected the church and how it affected Israel. There was a time of extreme urban unrest. Riots in cities. They happened all over. They happened in Rome to the point that the Jews got kicked out because of it. And they happened most notably also in Alexandria. At that time, a Greco-Roman city, not an Egyptian one in the Arab sense. A Greco-Roman city. Alexandria, a huge city. At certain points, it was the second biggest city in the Roman Empire. Well, Julius Caesar went there and so forth. Let's understand what happened. There were riots in Alexandria, and there were gang wars between pagans and Jews. The Emperor Caligula intervenes and he threatens to go to Jerusalem and place an image of himself in the temple, in the Jewish temple before it was destroyed, as Antiochus Epiphanes did in the times of the Maccabees, 175, 180 years earlier. In other words, it looked to the Christians like the Shikusa Meshulmem, the abomination of desolation, was coming. Now, he didn't do it, but he threatened to. That in itself was interesting. Now, this happened in an environment going back to Caesar Augustus, who was emperor when Jesus was born. That is emperor worship. They were deified in their lifetime. Other emperors like Julius Caesar were deified posthumously, but with Caesar Augustus, you had emperors deified in their lifetime. In my book, Shadows of the Beast, I explain the relationship between emperor worship and the Antichrist to come. Nonetheless, let's understand this. This whole thing with the urban violence and rebuilding a temple or going into a temple and putting the image in it, that was something that the early Christians witnessed taking place. An environment with this mass urban violence, growing anti-Semitism, and a focus on the Temple Mount. Does this sound familiar? Well, this is exactly what transpired at this time. Now, Caligula was a madman. His daughter was Drusilla. It's unbelievable what he did. But let's note certain things about his reign before he was assassinated in a coup d'etat, and certain things about his successor, Claudius. First of all, it was Caligula who was desperate to keep England in the European-based Roman Empire. He wanted Britain in the Roman Empire. The battle to keep England in the empire and Wales went on and on and on for generations, until the time of the Emperor Constantine, who became emperor when he was a general in York in the north of England. York, for 2 years, was the de facto capital of the Roman Empire because that's where Constantine was based as a general when he became emperor. Desperate to keep England in the empire and to stop the invasion of the Picts and Scots and so forth. This went on then. This whole thing about Britain, it went on for generations, beginning with Caligula, ending with Constantine. They wanted a Brexit. There was a fight with Europe over a Brexit. These things happened in the first century church, and they're happening during the time of the 21st century church. Now, another word about this Caligula. They got rid of him. He was so crazy. And he was into bringing black Africans into the Roman Empire. He annexed Mauritania and Africa. Normally, the Romans were only interested in the north, the coastal area north of the Sahara. The Sahara was the natural barrier. They were not interested much in the Sahel, as we call it now. He extends not only to the north, into England and Wales. He extends into the south and tries to unite Black Africa, specifically Mauritania, into the Roman Empire. He's doing this stuff. You see moves afoot in Africa now of people pouring these immigrants into Europe, and the EU saying, we can expand the EU to include certain African countries. Now then, it was mainly North Africans were Berbers, the Berber people, who were Christian, and then murdered, and their children taken, and they were forcibly converted to Islam later on. But the Berber people, the indigenous people of North Africa, were Indo-European, and they suffered tremendously for their faith, stood bravely for their faith, and would not, most of them, at least many of them, would not acquiesce to pagan Rome. It was when Islam came and the Arab invasion and colonization came, 7th century, 8th century, that's when it changed. Well, all these things go back to the time of Caligula. Just before the expulsion of the Jews from Rome that we read about in Acts 18, where Priscilla and her husband, who discipled Apollos, came from. Now, let's understand this further. Claudius comes to power with the backing of the Herodian kings, the descendants of Herod the Great. Remember, Herod the Great, a major type of the Antichrist, was considered to be a Jew by the Jews by virtue of religion. He, however, was an Idumean. He was an ethnic Arab. But the Romans considered him to be a Roman. So much did the Romans consider Herod the Great to be a Roman that they didn't appoint a proconsul until Herod the Great was gone. Then came Pontius Pilate in fulfillment of the prophecy of Genesis 49 with the scepter departing from Judah. I mentioned that only in passing. We deal with it on other teachings. So, he likes Agrippa. And he makes Herodians the king of Judea again. Now, in Acts chapter 12, we see what happened. There were food shortages. There were famines. And in Caesarea, another one of the cities where there was urban violence, it's where the second Jewish revolt began. We see that they kept crying out in Acts chapter 12:22, the voice of a man, not a God. Well, why were they saying this? They were saying this because their country was fed by the king's country. He controlled the food supply, so they worshiped him. He was an official of Rome in bed with the Roman imperial bureaucracy of Claudius. These things teach about the Antichrist to come. More than we can speak about today, but they're there. We have to understand this. Again, I point you to the book, Shadows of the Beast. But these are the things the first century Christians were witnessing. And these are the things the 21st century Christians are witnessing. We are seeing the same kind of things happen in Europe. The same kind of things happen with the Brexit. The same kind of things happening with the urban riots. The same kind of things happening with the Jews. The same kinds of things taking place. You want to know what the 21st century is going to be like, or the 21st century church? Look at the first century church. But let me explain further. The popular culture was dominated by socio-political and economic realities. One is that there was a permanent underclass. A permanent underclass. 25 to 30% of the population were disenfranchised slaves. It was kept that way. Government policies were designed to keep it that way. They feared a fourth servile war. There were 3 times that the slaves already rebelled. The third time was under someone called Spartacus, who was a a gladiator who knew how to fight. Be that as it may, they didn't want this. They tried to engineer a system to keep the underclass in place. And you see the same thing now. The programs and policies in the United States to keep Black Americans as a permanent underclass, doing what they always did. The party of slavery, the party of Jim Crow, well, they're doing the same thing now. I mean, the Democrats. You couldn't teach a black to read under Jim Crow. So now you have to have a failed public school system where you have black students from the inner cities graduating high school with a diploma who have an 8th grade reading level. You've got to keep them down. You got this kind of, it's all engineered to make a permanent underclass. In the American South, the slavery, a black man was a stud, a breeding stock. Then you put him back in chains. Now it's the same thing. You have the high Afro-American prison population. Donald Trump tried to reduce it. The Democrats drove it up with the Clinton and so forth, and Harris, they drove it up. I mean, this was the kind of thing you had. You had social engineering designed to maintain a permanent underclass to the economic benefit of the establishment. This is what happened. Well, slavery, Jim Crow, and now you've got the welfare state. It's the same. It's all, these are not new things. They happened in the first century. Well, let's continue looking. There are 2 books that are absolutely crucial in understanding this. The first book that was written before the time of Christ, but not long before, and it was modeled after a book written by Plato, Plato's Republic, but a version of it, De Republica, was written by Cicero, modeled on Plato, who was a Greek. And it uses Socratic dialogue in 6 volumes to contend for a restoration of some kind of republican government. Under imperial Rome, the republic had fallen. The republic had fallen. Cicero is arguing for constitutional government in Socratic dialogue in these 6 volumes. Constitutional government was being usurped by imperial fiat. It's the same today. The Constitution means nothing. Absolutely nothing to these progressivists. First Amendment, suppressing of free speech. The things I'm saying now, there are people who will take it off the internet and call it hate speech simply because they don't agree with it politically. The suppression of free speech, the republic is going. Right to bear arms, and anything that threatens their position and interest. You can argue the way Cicero did. You can appeal to history and philosophy the way he did going back to Plato. You can contend for constitutional government the way he did. But the tide had turned. The republic had fallen. People were no longer electing leaders to the Senate and so forth. It was just a club. The rights they had, the kind of rights that Plato envisioned and Socrates envisioned, were gone. Another book was Seneca's De Clementia. Seneca's De Clementia, which was hortatory. Again, that was later. It was at the time of Nero. So at the time of Peter and Paul in Rome, Seneca's De Clementia was having a big impact. Now, again, you didn't have widespread literacy all over the place. The slaves certainly couldn't read, most of them. But a lot of people could read. And certainly the aristocrats and nobility could read, and they were influenced by Seneca's De Clementia, looking for mercy in a merciless society with a merciless government. You just look at the way like the IRS behaves towards people. I mean, they've gone in and they've taken people's money without a court order, with no reason other than their own suspicion. Oh, we believe that you're stacking and doing transactions for 9,000 instead of 10,000. Yeah, but 9,000 is legal. It doesn't matter. We suspect you. And they just, democracy is going. Government has become a heartless animal in a society that has been given over. That is the environment politically and culturally and economically that the first century Christians found themselves in to be witnesses for the Lord. Look with me, please, to Romans chapter 13. Romans 13. Every person is to be subject in subjection to the governing authorities. There's no authority except from God. I hate to admit it, but people like George Bush and Barack Obama and Biden, God allowed them to get that authority. And those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. And they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what's good, and you'll have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God for your good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. It's a minister of God, an avenger, who brings wrath on the one who practices it. Not only is it necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but because of conscience sake. For because of this you pay taxes, and rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to the very thing. Render to all what is due tax, to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. As long as they do not cause us to have to sin, we must be in subject to them. As long as they do not cause us to go against the law of God, we must be in subject to their laws, even though they are despotic. He's talking here about pagan governments. I've seen these things that Christians shouldn't pay taxes for this, or they're funding abortion, therefore we shouldn't pay taxes. That's going to be on them. That's going to be on them. But what happens when you find yourself in a gray area where practicing your faith becomes illegal? Look with me, please, to the book of Revelation, chapter 2. Verse 10. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have thlipsis, tribulation, 10 days, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. Expect tribulation, expect persecution, expect the possibility of martyrdom. Easy for me to say, but I have spent time in China, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, certain places in Africa. This is the reality for many Christians already. In fact, more Christians are being persecuted in the 21st century than in the first century. I'll say it again. More Christians numerically are being persecuted in the 21st century than in the first century. We don't go against God's laws for the sake of man's. But when man's laws don't cause us to go against God's, we stand. But realize we have to be ready to pay a price. That price we look upon as martyrdom, being a martyr. What martyr really means is to bear witness, to bear witness. If you're not willing to be persecuted or even killed for what you believe, that is faith in Christ. If you're not willing to die for it, you're not a faithful witness. And many Christians have, and many Christians shall. Now, Jesus told them, you will have tribulation. Please, I beseech you for the 10,000th time, do not buy into the pre-tribulation rapture myth. It is just not scriptural. We're not appointed unto wrath. The wrath of God will come upon our persecutors. But tribulation will first come upon the faithful church. Happening in many countries. And now, as the republic has fallen, as we see what Seneca wrote about and Cicero wrote about happening in Britain and America and Australia, we know the writings on the wall. The COVID restrictions and so forth, we've seen in Australia, in Israel, in Britain, they go beyond trying to control a pandemic. It's being politically manipulated. We know that. I'm not denying there is a pandemic. This need to control. The Roman Empire was driven by this need to control, this fear of losing it. It concerned the underclass, it concerned the urban riots, and it concerned an unstable economy. But it concerned other things as well. For 300 years, the ancient Persians, the Parthians, resisted Rome. There were two primary empires that were not part of the Roman Empire that were in the known world. One was the Armenian Empire. The Armenian Empire was the first empire to embrace Christianity. The Armenians became Christians before the Roman Empire, before Constantine. Their church today is basically, some of it's monophysite, and it resembles the Eastern Orthodox Church, but they've had powerful Pentecostal revivals in Armenia. And there are large numbers in the United States and California of Armenian evangelicals. This goes way, way back before the Roman Empire. The Coptic churches, the Eastern churches, the Armenian churches, all predate the Roman Catholic Church, no matter what they try to tell you about Peter, etc. But let's understand this. The Romans weren't afraid of anybody. In a battle, nobody could beat them. But there were those who could match them. The Celts, up to a point, the Jews under Titus, and the Persians, that is, the Parthians. There was a fear of a resurgent Persia, or what we would say the Iranian threat. The Jews were so afraid of Iran, of Persia, of the Parthians, that they made a deal with Rome. They thought they were going to be a Roman protectorate. They would be protected by Rome. Instead, they wound up a Roman colony after they signed on the dotted line. The betrayal was illustrated when the General Pompey, not the high priest on the Day of Atonement, but the General Pompey entered the Holy of Holies of the temple. He was from the triumvirate, going back to Cleopatra and things like that, and Mark Antony. He and Caesar, Julius Caesar, he entered the Holy of Holies. Again, a major picture of the Antichrist. Iran was seen as a big threat to both Middle Eastern and European strategic security in the first century. What do you have now? Go online or pick up a newspaper. Something else happened. There was a popular culture of violence where violence was entertainment. It began in the Peloponnese, particularly Corinth, but it quickly found its way into Rome. The Colosseum was not yet built in the first century. It would be built later. But the whole gladiatorial contests had been around. Spartacus was a gladiator. Been around. Violence was entertainment. You look at the majority of computer games played by young people. Most of them involve killing, shooting, fighting. It simply makes people callous to the realities of lost life. I recall watching a clip. They couldn't show what was actually happening because it was classified, but they were reporting what was happening. At Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, you had these American Air Force officers who lived in the suburbs of Las Vegas. They had civilian clothes. They looked like they were playing golf. They would drive to work and put on combat fatigues. And they would sit at a computer console. And by simply pushing buttons and working joysticks, they were launching cruise missiles thousands and thousands of miles away in Iraq, targeting who they wanted to kill. And they were in Nevada, but they were killing people on the other side of the world. Howbeit terrorists and things like this. It was like playing a computer game. It was the same kind of technology, only more advanced. People became super callous to the violence. They'd seen so much of it. It was in their entertainment. That is the environment we're in today. I read something today where two thugs, who were associated with Black Lives Matter, by the way, attacked a pregnant woman, putting her other child into a car in a parking lot outside of a supermarket in the United States. They attacked her and tried to rob her. They hurt her physically, cracked her head open. She screams. A U.S. Air Force veteran from Iraq comes to her aid. They shoot him. Means nothing to them. 4,000 people were shot in Chicago in 2020. 4,000. 1,000 were shot dead. Coincidentally, most of them black people, nearly all of them black people, shot dead by other black people, including little kids going to school on the south side of Chicago. Black Lives Matter didn't care. They don't care. I'm not trying to talk about Black Lives Matter, but it just shows you the hypocrisy and the moral callousness of a violent society. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That's the way it was in the first century. That is the environment, the culture that Christians found themselves in the first century. How do you be a witness for Christ in that kind of an environment? Yet Paul said, the gospel we must preach, for the wrath of God is coming. Well, now let's look at what is obvious in Romans chapter 1. Homosexuality, bisexuality, lesbianism, and transgenderism were so profligate, it became unimaginable. Most of the Roman emperors were bisexual. Some were homosexual. But let's understand this even further. There was an emperor, Elagabalus, about 222 AD. He was a man who proclaimed himself to be a woman. Transgenderism became a legal definition by imperial decree. The Supreme Court thinks it can overrule the supreme being. And God gives them over to it because he's giving them over to his wrath. An emperor actually did it. People follow this. The day we call Christmas, the 25th of December, by the pre-Gregorian Old Julian calendar, to the Romans it was the Feast of Saturnalia, where they practiced cross-dressing. This was widespread throughout the empire, and it's something that Paul warns against, in at least alludes to it in an adverse manner in 1 Corinthians 11. The whole cross-dressing, transvestite phenomena, the homosexuality, lesbianism, bisexuality, seen as normative. And there were those who wanted to get it into the church because it was the popular culture, gay-friendly. Happening today. But you know what? God gave them over to it. It's a frightening thing. God gave them over to it. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So we put this together. Urban violence. Violence is entertainment in the popular culture. Widespread acceptance of homosexuality, bisexuality, lesbianism, and then transsexuality. The suspension of reason. The persecution of the church. Remember, Christians were persecuted because they wouldn't go along with this agenda. And it goes on. And it happens in a political climate where the republic had fallen. Democracy was gone. There was a make-believe democracy. The Senate rubber-stamped what was decided by the imperial powers. This began with Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was one of the chief figures that engineered the transition from republic into empire. He was one of the chief figures. But once it happened, Seneca or Cicero couldn't get it back. When democracy goes, it is very hard to recover, at least in a godless society. Once again, the Parthians are back. We call them the Iranians. Ethnically the same people, geographically the same land. A permanent underclass. But there was something else. The desperation for unity. Pax Romana. They wanted a new world order. So they used multiculturalism. They said, we'll make Greek the lingua franca instead of Latin. Today they say we'll do it with English instead of French or German, whatever. Chinese, whatever, Mandarin. They agreed on a lingua franca that was not their own. Nations do the same thing now. Of course, this has to do with the cyber world and pop culture and so forth, but this is reality. And in multiculturalism, they saw the key to it as what we would call the pantheon, ecumenism. You can have any religion you want as long as you join the club and play by the rules. The emperor, as the head of the pantheon, was called the pontiff. That is the Pontificus Maximus. We again explain this in my books, The Dilemma of Laodicea and Shadows of the Beast. He's the bridge builder between religions. You can have what religion you want, as long as you acknowledge the pontiff. You look at the Pope, this present Pope who calls himself Francis. He refused to stand against pedophilia when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires in Argentina. Last week, over 450 priests in Austria said they're going to defy any objections he has to same-sex marriage and continue to bless them. There's no theological unity or moral cohesion in the Catholic Church. What is he? A political figure who uses religiosity to feign a moral credibility. He was in Iraq 3 weeks ago meeting with Muslim leaders. It's all a joke. This is the pantheon of Rome revisited. They need to have multicultural harmony. Therefore, they need to have multi-religious harmony. The Roman Empire began to fall to pieces. They had a Brexit. Romans sent Anglo-Saxons from Germany to colonize Britain, and then they had to send their legions. Again, that is where Constantine became the emperor. Brexit. The empire fragmented between its Latin-speaking west and its Greek-speaking east to the point that Constantine had to move his capital from Rome to Istanbul, then called Constantinople. They did everything and anything they could do to maintain a political, social, and economic cohesion, including multiculturalism and interfaith religion, the pantheon. The Christians could not be part of this, so they were persecuted. This continued for centuries in the early church until the time of the Novatian Schism and supralapsarianism and so forth. These other things happened as a result in time. But it goes right back to the first century. As it was in the beginning is now. You want to know what happened? Look at what's happening. If you want to understand what's happening, look at what happened. And if you want to understand what's going to happen, look at what happened in the apostolic church. What happened then is happening now. And what happened then will happen in the future. Not difficult to understand. Not all that complicated in concept. When you understand the New Testament in light of the times, the Leben in which it was written, in light of the history in which it was written, it all adds up, all makes sense. You don't have to be an academic. You don't have to be a scholar. All you need is the Holy Spirit and a bit of common sense. What should we be like? We should be like the first century church. My name is James Jacob Prasch from Memorial Ministries. God bless and thank you for listening.